Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website. Would ask our guests in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been silenced. It's always appreciated. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Or, as Ilan would like me to point out, you can buy his book and then you don't have to go to the website, you see? Great idea, okay? You'll second that, right? Welcoming and introducing our guest today is Stephen Bucci, who serves as director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He previously served here as a senior research fellow for Defense and Homeland Security. He served 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He has served as military assistant to Secretary Rumsfeld for 5.5 years, and upon his retirement, he continued to work at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. He is an expert and consultant on cybersecurity and worked with IBM on those issues. He is also an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming Steve Bucci. Steve?
Okay, let me add my welcome to all of you that are here or who are joining us online. This is a nice feeling for me because I actually know this speaker, which is kind of nice. Ilan Berman is the Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council here in D.C. He is a recognized expert in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation, which gives him a pretty wide span of expertise. And some people, I would say, they were puffing themselves up, but I know him, and he's not. He is an expert in those areas, and frankly, one of the most reasonable commentators on the issues involved in them that you'll find. He doesn't speak unless he has the information to back up his positions. Even CNN, and I don't normally agree with CNN on too much stuff, has called him one of the leading experts on the Middle East and Iran. He also teaches for the Missouri State University's Defense and Strategic Studies program here in Washington. He has written for Forbes.com, the Washington Times, and is the editor of the Journal of International Security Affairs. He has written a ton of books about totalitarian regimes, several specifically on Iran, and another one on radical Islam and on Russia. And the reason we're here today is because his newest book is out, Iran's Deadly Ambition, The Islamic Republic's Quest for Global Power. Could not be more timely with its publication. And what we'll do is we're going to give Ilan a chance to talk about the book a little bit, or whatever he darn well pleases to talk about, because frankly all of his subject areas are relevant and pretty important. And then we'll give him about 15 minutes or so to present what he has, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time doing questions, and I will recognize you. Someone will bring you a microphone, and you can ask your question. Please ask a question. Don't give a speech. Whether you agree or disagree with him, don't make a speech, because if you do, I'll ask you to sit down. So ask a question, let him answer, and then we'll go from there. So with that, I will turn it over to Ilan.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Oh, thank you, guys. This is wonderful. I'll try to stay on topic. I do cover a fairly broad range of topics in my day job, but it's a good thing that when you work on Russia and Iran and radical Islam, that all these portfolios are looking really good at the moment. So there's nothing to really talk about. But so I'm a lawyer by training, and even though I don't practice, old habits die hard. So I like to style myself as a recovering lawyer, but it compels me to tell you that what you're going to hear is, I have consulted for various government agencies, but what you're going to hear is what I hope is an informed opinion, that of myself and that of my institution, the American Foreign Policy Council. We spend a lot of time consulting for government agencies, but I always like to joke that if they saw Iran, if the administration saw Iran quite the way I did, perhaps we wouldn't have concluded this deal. But So it's all water under the bridge, but it's useful to talk about in context of sort of exactly what we've done and in context of what we can expect. So let me start by thanking Heritage because it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to speak before colleagues. It's an even greater pleasure to speak before friends. So it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to sort of have the opportunity to sort of lay out and possibly entice you with my book. So what hopes? So let me, because my time is limited, let me talk about three essential things. First of all, understanding Iran and what it wants. And the second is sort of what Iran is doing to make that vision happen. And the third is sort of what's most germane at the moment, which is how we can expect Iranian behavior to change as a result of this deal that was concluded over the summer and that has just been passed by default in the U.S. Congress. So let me start with a somewhat inflammatory contention, which is that we don't understand Iran. We don't understand Iran because we are used in the U.S. diplomatic corps, among diplomats here in Washington and, frankly, in European capitals, of saying what we mean and ideally meaning what we say. We tend to speak in a unitary voice. So when you hear President Obama give a speech about the Iran deal, as he gave a month or so ago, at American University, it was an earnest exposition of his views on the Iran deal. It was not a duplicitous speech. It was a speech that actually articulated what he thought of the Iran deal and what he's likely to do with it. The reason that's important is because we speak in a unitary voice, a unitary message, we are at a disadvantage when we are confronted with countries that don't, that have different messages for different audiences. And Iran is one of those countries. So I would make the argument that while we're speaking in one voice about the Iran deal, about Iran's nuclear program, the Iranians are actually speaking in four separate voices about the nuclear program and about everything else. So the voice that we're hearing loudest is this idea of pragmatic mercantilism, right? This is the arms control discussion. This is the sort of the Iran as a nation state that's willing to barter. It's willing to trade away things that it cares about and wants to strike a deal. This is the message that we heard most clearly in Lausanne, Switzerland, before that in Vienna. This is the conversation that Iran is having with us and the other members of the P5+1 over its nuclear program. And in this context, right, messengers matter. So it's not a coincidence that to a man, every emissary of Iran that is communicating in this language, in this tenor, is urbane, is sophisticated, is well-versed in the English language, is the darling of the sophisticated diplomatic set in places like Washington and in New York. But it's only part of the larger conversation that Iran is having with the world. Because as it's talking to us about its nuclear program, Iran is also talking to the Islamic world, and it's saying a very different thing. In the Islamic world, what Iran is talking about is primacy, ideological primacy, and this long-running struggle for competition, ideological legitimacy that is going on between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. It's a competition that animates a great deal of what Iran does regionally. And it's one that has gathered steam as Iran has grown in international prominence as a result of its nuclear program. The third tenor, the third register that Iran speaks in is one of Shiite sectarianism. Because even as it's talking to the entire Muslim world about the legitimacy of its will to power, it's also talking to the Shiite segment, that 15% of the Muslim world that's Shiite, about empowerment. And here it's a little bit of a sort of a deviation to talk about the long-running ideological contest between Sunnis and Shiites in the Muslim world, but it's very important because historically, Shiites in the Muslim world are a distinct minority, but they're also a politically quiescent minority. They're one that hasn't been empowered. And Iran is trying to change all that. And since the Islamic Revolution 35 years ago, Iran has propounded this radical activist worldview, that the Shiites should rise, they should reclaim their legitimate place in the Muslim world, and Iran is going to show them how. And this conversation is the one that Iran is having with Shiite rebels in Yemen, with Shiite militias in Iraq, with the Shiite majority opposition to the ruling Al Khalifa family in Bahrain, right? But this is the conversation. This is the language that they're speaking, in which the Shiites should rise up, they should grab more political power, and Iran will support them. And at the same time as Iran is having all those three conversations, Iran is also having a fourth one with countries outside of the Muslim world. This is a conversation about third world populism and about revising the global order. For those of you that remember, and for those of you that have paid attention to this, you remember that the former Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, used to come every September to the UN General Assembly and give an inflammatory speech, which was without fail loaded with pejoratives, loaded with all sorts of messianic rhetoric. But what he actually said was very important, because year after year, Ahmadinejad would talk about the fact that what Iran wanted to do, in addition to reconfiguring the global order in the Muslim world, was also to empower the have-nots, to create a new world order, one that upsets the traditional balance that's, of the world that's dominated by the United States, by Europe, even by Asia. This is the conversation that Iran is having with countries in West Africa or countries in Latin America. It's one about fraternal relations between regimes that are very different, but relations that are going to be empowered by Iran's global rise. So the reason all of this is important is because it animates that question about what Iran wants. Iran is not a status quo power. Iran has much more in common with countries like Russia and countries like China than it does with countries like Belgium. Iran is, not to put too fine a point on it, a revolutionary movement with borders. And it's been one since the Islamic Revolution 35 years ago. The reason that's important is because Iran, at least up until now, the conventional wisdom has been that Iran has had to choose. Henry Kissinger gave an interview to the Financial Times a few years ago in which he was sort of dispensing his pearls of wisdom, and he said that with regard to Iran ultimately, under the current configuration of the world, Iran will have to choose. Is it a country or is it a cause? It can't be both, but it'll need to choose. I would make the contention that, and we'll talk about this in a second, but as a result of the exceedingly generous offsets that are included in the current nuclear deal, Iran's not going to have to choose. But even before the nuclear deal goes into effect, because remember, it's not in effect now, and it won't be for at least a little bit of time longer, what you see is an Iran that has made a choice. It's made a choice in favor of global activism. And here, what we're looking at is not an Iran that believes that it can dominate even its immediate neighborhood, let alone Latin America and West Africa and in Europe and Asia, in the near term. But it's one that in which Iran tries to reconfigure the regional balance to make it more favorable to Iran, to lessen its isolation, and also to increase its freedom of global maneuver. What this looks like in Iran's immediate neighborhood is an attempt by Iran from the early stirrings of the Arab Spring in late 2010, early 2011, to co-opt the narrative. Iranian officials from the speaker of their single-chamber parliament, the Majlis, on down, talked about how the Arab Spring was the belated expression of support for Khomeini's revolution, and therefore, Iran was destined to lead the Arab Spring. It didn't quite turn out that way, but that's certainly what they said. But in places like Egypt and in places like Bahrain, there were early attempts to do just that, to reconfigure national politics to make a more compliant government be the one that's in power. These weren't successful, but in other places, they have been. In Yemen, over the last year, Iran has, through aid, through military support, and through the provision of military material, facilitated a coup d'etat. They have allowed the pro-Iranian Shiite Houthi rebels to overrun the pro-Western government of Abd Rabbo al-Hadi. And so now Iran has become a kingmaker in Yemeni politics. And that's significant in and of itself, but it's also significant because Iran, which already sits atop of the Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of global oil travels, now also by proxy controls the Bab al-Mandab, which is a not insignificant waterway that leads to the Suez Canal. In Syria, what Iran has attempted to do has been to, well, depending on how you depict it, to forestall the inevitable, to forestall the collapse of the Assad regime. But it's done so with tremendous resources. The U.S. government estimates that Iran has spent on the order of $6 billion a year on propping up the Assad regime, on providing it with military equipment, on providing it with military personnel in the form of IRGC detachments of Iran's clerical army, the Revolutionary Guard, providing them with drones that they can use for drone warfare against opposition groups. This is a heavy investment. And it's interesting in the context of what we're seeing now in Syria, because Russia, over the last 3 weeks, has joined Iran in its attempts to stabilize and prop up the Assad regime. But that effort, the effort on the part of the Iranians, began much earlier and has been, in many ways, equally sophisticated, although far less overt than what Russia is doing currently. This global agenda plays out not just in Iran's immediate periphery, it also plays out in places like Latin America. And so for those of you that have followed Latin America over the last 10 years or so, you know that the most vibrant, most dominant alliance when you think of Iran in the region is that between Iran and Venezuela. The anti-American axis that Iran and Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez attempted to erect in Latin America was significant in and of itself. But it was also significant because Iran used Venezuela as a gateway to open up a conversation with the larger region. And so now Iran has insinuated itself into the politics of the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, this anti-American bloc that was created in the early 2000s by Chavez and the Castro brothers in Cuba, but one that continues without Chavez and still with the leadership of the Castro brothers, but also with the rise of regimes like that of Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa in Ecuador. This is significant because Latin America is changing. Venezuela is not what it used to be. It's in the process of a slow-motion economic implosion. But that doesn't mean that Iran has lost its foothold. In many ways, if you look around Latin America today, you look at the leftist tilt in Honduran politics and in Peruvian politics and others, you see a region that's different from what Iran experienced a decade ago. But it's not any less hospitable. In fact, if you're Iranian and you're looking at this region, you're looking at a situation where you might have new avenues for expanded political influence over the next several years. And this gets us, I think, there's other things to talk about. We can talk about West Africa and we can talk about Asia. But I think the real rub of the matter is how this agenda is impacted by real-world events. And here we're looking at what the impact of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the formal name for the new nuclear deal that was concluded by us and the other members of the P5+1 countries over the summer, what impact concretely it will have on Iran's global ambitions. So here I think we need to start with what the deal does. And I was pleased to be part of a panel that was here a few weeks ago talking about sort of the impact in terms of sanctions relief that's inherent in the nuclear deal. And I think it's worth reiterating that point because for most people, it's really of a scope that's very hard to comprehend. So let me posit that I work for a nonprofit. So I don't know what $100 billion looks like. And I don't know what $150 billion looks like. But it's a lot. And I think all of you intrinsically know that it's a lot, but it may be useful to put in context because you don't know exactly how much it is. So here's a little bit of a sort of frame of reference for you. Last year, in 2014, Iran's annual GDP was $415 billion. So what you're looking at is sanctions relief that is equivalent to roughly a quarter of the Iranian economy. So what does that look like in comparative terms? So first of all, as a historical analogy, in 1948, the Truman administration initiated something called the European Recovery Program. Right? You may not know that name. You may know the formal name, or the informal name, which is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a 4-year plan to stimulate the post-war economies of 17 separate countries in Europe. Right? And it was one that did so by allocating, in 1948 dollars, $13 billion, which equals out to about $120 billion in today's dollars, for 17 countries over 4 years. And we know the salutary effects that this had on European economy, even extending to today, to the present day. What you're looking at then is a near-term grant, gift, to Iran that is many Marshall Plans. This isn't just a Marshall Plan for Iran. This is many Marshall Plans for Iran. And it's so large that if you transpose it to the American economy, it would be as if the United States, over the next 6 to 8 months, received a cash grant of $4.2 trillion. Right? The U.S. economy is $16.7 trillion. Right? A quarter of that is $4.2 trillion. So this begs the question, what is Iran going to do with this money? So the administration has waxed, I think, very poetic about how this money, Iran has debts and it'll pay off its debts, and Iran is going to stabilize its economy, and it's going to sort of, lower the rate of inflation. It's going to sort of invest in roads and infrastructures. To which I answer, absolutely. If the United States got a cash gift of $4.2 trillion, you know what we would do with that money? Everything we would do with that money. That's a scope of financial infusion that's so large that it obviates hard choices. We would, with that amount of cash, be able to invest in infrastructure and invest in economic stabilization and invest in the defense budget and invest in any other foreign policy priority that we have. And I think, realistically, this is what we can expect from Iran moving forward. We are entering a period where the likely impact of the deal on Iranian behavior is going to play out in 3 or 4 concrete fronts that are going to be very dangerous to American security. The first is support for global terrorism. So Iran has been formally designated as a state sponsor of global terrorism since a year after the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut. It's a mantle that it's worn proudly, and it's a mantle that encompasses a very large range of activity, destabilizing activity on the part of the Iranian regime. Just how large was confirmed most recently by an interesting Congressional Research Service memorandum that was commissioned by Senator Mark Kirk from Illinois at the end of July, in which the good senator asked Congress to map out the scope of Iranian investment in terrorism. And what the end result was a rather broad range. It was anywhere from $3.6 billion to $16 billion. And the variation accounted for, do you include in that sum the $6 billion that they spend on Syria? Do you include the several $billion a year that they spend on Yemen, et cetera? Whatever it is, it's a large sum of money. It is, not to put too fine a point on it, exactly what Undersecretary of the Treasury Stuart Levy said a few years ago when he said publicly that Iran has a 9-digit line item in its budget for support of terrorism. And remember that it has that 9-digit line item even when it's constrained by sanctions. And we are sort of entering a period where Iran is going to have money that it can potentially use sort of in this venue with very significant destabilizing effects, both for our security and also for the security of our allies, certainly in Iran's immediate periphery, but likely beyond as well. By way of comparison, if Iran spends just 10% of the sanctions relief that it gets as a result of the nuclear deal, it would double or triple its current investment in international terrorism, right? That's a pretty hefty sum. And think about what Iran is doing already and what it can do with these expanded funds. I think it raises some serious concerns. The second is military modernization. The Iranians have talked for a long time about a sustained national military modernization program, and they are finally in the throes of kicking one off in earnest. On June 30th, so 2 weeks before the nuclear deal was formally announced, the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, publicly outlined what his government called the 6th development plan for his regime, which included, among other things, a plan to increase military spending to 5% of GDP, which equates out to an infusion of $6 or $7 billion additional to what they're spending now. The reason that's important is, let us posit that it's going to take years for Iran to acquire more ships and more planes and, planes that don't fall out of the sky and more tanks and, better equipment. And so the practical effects of Iran's military modernization are going to take time to materialize. But the political effects of the impression that Iran is arming, that Iran is rising, that Iran is expanding qualitatively its capability to menace the region begins right now. because as soon as the plan was announced, and as soon as it became clear 2 weeks later that Iran will soon have the cash to make this plan a reality, everyone else began to follow suit. And so what you're beginning to see is the start of what existed late last decade before it was derailed by the Arab Spring, which is a scramble for strategic counterweights to Iran's capabilities, both conventional and unconventional. You see this in Saudi conversations about a revived path to the bomb, including through collusion with Pakistan. You see this through massive conventional military purchases by the Gulf states, which are going to be offset by the U.S. government with tremendous costs to the U.S. Treasury. So I think this is a very inauspicious development. And the third this, I think, dovetails with the third point, which is that the nuclear deal is pernicious in the sense that it mischaracterizes what it's actually supposed to do. So remember that the initial goal of the deal was to permanently end Iran's quest for a nuclear weapons capability. In fact, the deal doesn't do that. The provisions of the deal only focus on temporarily delaying, on drawing out the timeline it takes for Iran to perfect its existing nuclear infrastructure without rolling any of it back. The reason that's important is because President Obama has said on multiple occasions that this deal cuts off all pathways by which Iran can get a nuclear weapon. So let us posit that there are only two pathways by which Iran can get a nuclear weapon. It can build one, or it can buy one. And the build part of the equation has been slowed down. We can debate exactly how much, but it's clear that there are certain requirements that are going to make it difficult for Iran to move out smartly without violating the deal and immediately build a device. But at the same time, we have effectively nudged Iran into the buy part of the equation. We're giving them the capital to actually procure a nuclear device through foreign suppliers. And if this sounds far-fetched, it shouldn't. For those of you that are familiar with Iran's long-standing strategic relationship with countries like North Korea, you know that Iran has tactical cooperation on nuclear development and on ballistic missile development and on a range of conventional weapons systems with not only with North Korea, but also, for example, with private buyers in China and in other places. So the idea that Iran will have added resources to sink into illicit procurement, I think, is a very dangerous development, especially precisely because of the nature of that procurement, it's going to be difficult to track and even more difficult for us to respond to it. And this gets us to, I think, the question of Iran's position in the world. So we started by talking about this global agenda and this vision that Iran has of being a global power, acting like a global power. The Iranians in their literature have a phrase, which I'm going to butcher it because I'm not a fluent Farsi speaker, but roughly in my Americanized Farsi is Markazi Zamin, which is the center of the universe. Not literally, of course, right, but geopolitically. Iran sees itself as the center of the geopolitical universe in its immediate neighborhood, the one around which all global politics will revolve, right? It's acting accordingly in Yemen, in Syria, and even beyond its immediate periphery. Iran, for the first time, is within reach of actually realizing this vision, not only in concrete material terms, in terms of acquiring military capabilities, but also in terms of its relationships. So think back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, about Iran's not illicit, but certainly anti-American partnerships with Bolivia and with Venezuela and with Ecuador. Iran's technological and strategic cooperation with countries like North Korea, right? And the list goes on. Iran's arms provisions to Sudan, and so on and so forth. And what you discover is this is a really nasty web of international relationships. But it's also a web that has been constrained up until now, at least in part, by real world economic restrictions, right? An Iran that's sanctions constrained, an Iran that is struggling to nationally put food on the table, to keep the lights on, may have grand ambitions, but it doesn't necessarily have reach that's as grand as its ambitions are. And we are now in a position of changing that equation. This deal is a vehicle for Iran to move from being a partner of these other rogue regimes to being a patron of them, right? And that creates a scenario by which the global security environment that the U.S. is going to confront both in the Middle East and far beyond, has the potential to become dramatically more dangerous in the years ahead, as Iranian resources, whether through commerce or through gifts, translate out to greater capabilities on the part of the North Koreans or the Sudanese or the Ecuadorians or the Bolivians. And so this is, I know, a very glass half empty rendering of the nuclear deal. I don't think it's entirely without merit. And I think when we look at what Iran says and what Iran believes in its foundational documents, books like Khomeini's Islamic Government, the original first rendering of the Iranian Constitution of 1979, you understand that, hearkening back to that phrase that Henry Kissinger uttered in 2008, Iran feels like it doesn't have to choose between being a country or a cause. In fact, right now, Iran is acting as both. And as we move into implementation of the deal over the next weeks and months, Iran will feel less and less constrained and more empowered to act as both. So I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I get to ask the first question,
Okay.
mostly because I'm real concerned about it. But, two of your areas of expertise, Iran and Russia, we're having a point of confluence in Syria. How dangerous do you see the Russian moves, and how much of it do you think was empowered by us signing this agreement and the conversations with Soleimani in Moscow?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and there's certainly linkage, but I think it's linkage that's my view is that the linkage is a little bit different than what is being portrayed in the press. So the first overt linkage is the linkage between Iran and Ukraine. And this, I think, is important because it has a great deal of impact on precisely how robust we are in our Russia policy, or in this particular case, how not robust we are in our Russia policy, because if you haven't noticed, we don't have a Russia policy. There are many factors that go into that. There are factors that include, sort of the complete cratering of the reset policy that was launched in March of 2009, a lack of real material investments in European missile defense, right? So there's all sorts of things that play into that. But a not insignificant thing, at least up until now, has been the fact that a U.S. really squeezing Russia, really penalizing Russia over its aggression in Ukraine may find it more difficult to conclude a nuclear deal with Iran. Because Russia, after all, is a member of the P5+1 countries. And so Russia's compliance, Russia bringing Iran to the table, is a necessary prerequisite for all these developments that we've seen over the last couple of months. So I'm not the only one crazy enough to think about this. Richard Cohen wrote in the Washington Post, he actually wrote a piece called The Iran-Ukraine Affair. Right? I'm not sure it's an affair, but I think he hit the nail on the head that there is some linkage. There is some self-censorship on our part in dealing with Russia because we're afraid that the collateral damage is going to be that the Russians are going to be more difficult to work with over Iran. The second part of this is sort of what Russia is doing in Syria currently. So, as I said, right, the Iranians were in first. They have have an enormous investment. It is overshadowed by the overt military moves that the Russians are making currently, right? The building of a new air base in Latakia, the deployment of a relatively small air wing, right? But it's going to get bigger. Deployment of 2,000 troops, what have you. But the reality is that both countries are engaged in, at least for now, in a consonant venture. They are both heavily invested, although for different reasons, in the propping up of the Assad regime. Because for the Russians, this is a good hedge against Islamic radicalism back home, because a lot of Russian origin jihadis have actually gone to Syria to fight. The Russians would much rather Assad fight them there than they come back and the Russian government has to fight them at home. They're concerned about the loss of air basing, the loss of bases, naval bases and air bases now. The Iranians are concerned about the loss of a reliable proxy. But it's also, I think, an accurate reflection of what's actually happening on the ground in Syria. The reason the Russians chose to move at this time was not only because the opportunity was there, although it clearly was, but it was also because everybody that's soberly assessing Syria understands that the worm is turning, albeit very slowly, with regard to the action on the ground. Syria used to be, I think, neatly divided into three parts, where you have sort of Syrian opposition forces that are not the Islamic State in the west, you have the regime roughly in the center, and the Islamic State in the east. And those lines are increasingly becoming blurred, and the component, the third that is the regimes, is actually becoming smaller and smaller. So what you see on the part of Russia now, and I would argue if the Iranians have the resources to do it, on the part of Iran, again, soon enough, is going to be a doubling down of their investment in Syria, because their proxy of choice is losing on the ground, and they're going to try to help him at least temporarily reverse the tide.
Okay, all right, questions? I'm gonna get this young lady and then you next, Jim.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss. Thank you so much for your very interesting and depressing lecture.
Oh, but always with a smile on my face, though, so just, you know.
My question is about the citizenry of Iran. You hear a lot about how they're young and educated and want freedom and modernity, and then you hear other things like they're screaming death to America, and you're talking about having the rise of the Shia as a power which would affect them. Could you clarify where the citizenry stands in relation to their government? So
a decade ago, and again, I'm at Heritage, right? So the fact that I'm actually going to cite Tom Friedman, I think has to be a first, right? So it's okay. So Tom Friedman wrote a piece in 2005. I think the title was "An American in Paris." It had nothing to do with Iran, obviously. But in the piece, he talks about Iran, and he likens Iran to the ultimate red state. And at that time, he was looking at the comparative sophistication of the Iranian population, their youth, their connectivity, right? Iran is one of the most wired nations in the Middle East. It's not a hermit kingdom like North Korea, right? So you have all of these empirical data points that suggest that they are active and they are mobile and they are they're animated, and in many cases they were empowered. They certainly were empowered in the summer of 2009 when you had millions of Iranians come out in the street in this groundswell of opposition to the fraudulent re-election of Ahmadinejad as president, right? This became known as the Green Movement. You don't have that kind of mobility now. I mean, the way you sort of empirically can tell is that the Green Movement has been decimated by the regime because we, frankly, didn't do much. And in the last presidential go-round in the spring of 2013, when Hassan Rouhani ended up being elected, the dominant narrative among the Greens, among the opposition forces that were organized in Iran, was not whether or not they were going to field their own candidate, but whether they were going to boycott or they're going to support Rouhani. And they ended up deciding to support Rouhani, and he won sort of with a healthy majority, but the win has clearly gone out of these sails. So, and I think that's a useful example to give, because what you're talking about is not a static development. Iran is, I would argue, in many ways still a red state. Just sort of one data point which I think is useful is that the Islamic Revolution this year is 35 years old. The Iranians, who, not all, right? So the average, the average age of Iranians today, or earlier this year when it was polled by Pew or whoever, is 28.6 years old. The reason that's important is because it means that at least half the country wasn't alive when the revolution happened. So as the Soviet Union experienced for itself, when you have an ideological regime and your population falls below the age that it can cognitively embrace the creation myth, you're just accentuating the negative, right? Which is why you see Iranians talk about, well, we have privation, we have a lack of connectivity. The regime is bearing down on us. We have a censorship of the press, right? There's more and more public executions, right? It's all negative press. It's all, frankly, empowering ideas that one hopes would galvanize this urge for change. And here's where I think we enter a zone of danger, because we have chosen our Iran with this nuclear deal, right? So if you are with me so far, if you understand that there's really two Irans, there's a official Iran, this clerical regime, and then this captive population that's younger, thinks maybe not like we do, but certainly differently than the regime does, that sort of underlays it, then what you see is a deal that provides greater political legitimacy and greater capital to the first Iran to the detriment of the second. And one of our greatest challenges, and of Congress's greatest challenge moving forward, is to maintain that spotlight on Iran's human rights deformities to maintain that window of opportunity by which we can actually engage with the people who, by virtue of demography, will end up inheriting Iran. The question is when they will do it and whether they will like us when they do. So.
Okay, Jim Phillips. And we'll get you,
Jim
sir,
Phillips
and
here at Heritage. The Obama administration appears to see Iran as a useful ally against ISIS. And how realistic do you think this is in view of Iran's convoluted history with al-Qaeda and its continued efforts to prop up Assad?
Right. I think that's a great question. Just as an errata, right? I'm a lawyer. I'm a stickler for procedure. So 36 years, not 35 years, because I know there's people watching at home that are screaming at their computers. So 30. I'm not so good with math, so when I thought back to 79, I figured out that I made a mistake. But anyway, to your point, there's a phrase that we always sort of ascribe to Middle Eastern politics, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? That's, by the way, the animating ethos of the idea that if we can just change the tenor of our behavior with Iran, change the tenor of our relations, Iran will become maybe not a partner or a friend, but at least an erstwhile fellow traveler in the fight against ISIS, right? And ideally, I think, if you if you talk to the administration off the record, they'll tell you they would rather Iran carry that water than us carry that water, right? It certainly seems that way. Here's the problem. That axiom, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is a Western axiom. The axiom that prevails in the Middle East is me and my brother against my cousin, and me and my cousin against a stranger, right? And in this particular case, we are the stranger. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to see a grand strategic alliance between Iran and ISIS. There's many reasons to suspect that Iran is actually legitimately on the ground threatened by ISIS, and frankly, that the Iranians are willing to move robustly to confront them. But it also does mean that over the longer term, it's really unrealistic to think that we can translate anything Iran does on the ground against ISIS as a expression of their solidarity for any of our objectives moving forward. We have consonant tactical objectives with regard to the fight against ISIS, but I would be shocked if this translates into anything larger or more meaningful, because frankly, I don't think the regime is wired that way.
okay, let me get this gentleman and then you next.
Hi, my name is Mitsuo Nakai. Can you expand the relationship between North Korea and Iran? I do know North Korea and Russia is pretty close, but I don't know so much about the other friendship.
So there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm not going to sort of bore everybody, but a great empirical example of how they've cooperated is that the most popular, the most prominent missile that Iran has is a missile called the Shahab-3. It's a medium-range missile. It is a missile that was reverse engineered from North Korea's Nodong medium-range missile. It is an overt example of the type of strategic cooperation that's been going on between North Korea and Iran for a long time. And I think when you talk to North Korea specialists, including Bruce Klingner and others, what they'll tell you is that that cooperation is robust and it's ongoing and it happens at multiple levels. It's not just missiles. It's also, for example, at least tactical cooperation on nuclear tests and nuclear development and nuclear processes. But it's also one that's changing. Over the last several years, if you talk to North Korea experts, they'll tell you that you're seeing a reverse flow, whereas before, the Iranians were dependent on North Korea for a lot of their technology, a lot of their know-how. Increasingly, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing a more fulsome, dual partnership. And as I argued, when you have a North Korea that's cash-strapped, that has ready technology that would be of benefit to Iran's ballistic missile program or nuclear program, you have to become very concerned now that Iran has this durable relationship and also the cash to make it even bigger.
Young lady right here.
Hi, I'm Sierra Martin. I'm actually an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. So, based on what we're seeing, I would think it's actually not unreasonable to think that someday in the future that China and someone in the Middle East and Iran could actually somewhat work together for this conquest of gold power. Now, Russia and China have never really gotten along together. It's always been kind of like the internal battle. So do you think it is actually possible if, in my opinion, we get our heads screwed on straight in terms of Russian policy, that we could actually work together with Russia to kind of bear down on this? Because Putin is very against Islamic right now because it presents a real danger to them, and he is that aggressive state.
So I think there's been for those that have watched Russia for a long time, there's always been that hope that, at the end of the day, the Iranians are geographically closer to Russia. Their missiles can menace Russian territory before they can menace Europe, before they can menace the United States. So this doesn't make any sense. And so all I can think of is that there's an anecdote that makes its rounds about how Vladimir Putin was meeting with a foreign leader a few years ago, and he was being asked about precisely this, which is, why are you feeding the beast? Why, the Iranians will eat you first. Why are you doing this? And he gave all these explanations, and then ultimately he said, well, it's because, frankly, at the end of the day, the Israelis will handle it, so we don't have to worry about it. So from a Russia, it sounds very callous. Also sounds, I think, less feasible than it did a few years ago. Nonetheless, from a Russian perspective, if that's what you truly believe, then this is effectively a cost-free venture. You can prop up Iran and do so without worrying about long-term ill effects. But I would point this out. So the Russians, I would contend, don't like the Iranians necessarily. They don't have any warm spot in their heart for the Iranians. But they do understand that the Iranians play an important role. A NATO alliance, a Western community of nations that's busy putting out fires in the Middle East, is less and less likely to interfere in Russia's geopolitical backyard, right? Russia has made the calculation that the places it really cares about, Central Asia and Eastern Europe and Belarus and Moldova and Ukraine, are important. And the way it gets a freer hand there is by fomenting a more complicated situation beyond the periphery. And so feeding the Iranian beast, as it were, and sort of, propping up Iran and expanding Iran's capabilities for the Russians is a useful way to have a proxy that it can rely on, but it's also a useful way to expand its near-term room for maneuver, right? And the Ukraine example I gave, I think, is a perfect one. The Russians, at least for now, have received enormous benefit in terms, you can't prove sort of a hypothetical, right? But I would argue that if we didn't really need Russia for so many things, we might be harder on them with regard to their Ukraine policy, right? So we won't know. But my sense is that this is a calculation that the Kremlin thinks is a good one for now, and it's especially a good one if it thinks that at the end of the day, the Israelis are going to clean up their mess.
All right, this gentleman right here.
A follow-up on the citizenry question. So I've often thought about this. This may be a bad corollary, but just in the United States, we have Christianity, which is really comfortable with the spread of the religion throughout the world. And I think in Scripture, it's mostly thought of as done through missionary work, not by the sword. And even with democracy, we would be pleased if more of that spread throughout the world. And so it's not unheard of to have your ideals spread throughout the world. And then when you look at Islam, and they would be pleased with their religion spreading throughout the world. Is there a corollary there, or where does it diverge? Is it not the same thing? Do they diverge in the way that they would want it spread by the sword, or they don't?
So it's not the same thing, and we're not going to get into a big religious discussion. Also, because frankly, we're on the record, and anyway. But right, nothing good ever happens from talking religion on the record, I think. But with the Iran context, I actually think it's an important point, because what you see, the dominant view of Islam as propounded by the Iranian regime, is a radical, expansionist, politically activist one. But it's not necessarily the dominant view of Islam as propounded within the Shia, right? So if you do the math, the Muslim community globally is 1.6, 1.7 billion people, right? It's like a sixth or so of humanity. Shiites are a distinct minority. They're about 15%. And Iran has positioned itself, has appointed itself as the political ruler of that 15%. But if you look at the hierarchy of religious authority within Iran, what you figure out pretty early is that Khomeini was the guy, right? Khomeini was Mr. Islamic Republic. He was both the Rahbar, the political leader, and the Marja Taqlid, the model of religious emulation that most Shiites followed. And so what he said had enormous legitimacy. The current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, when Khomeini died on that day in 1989, started the day as a mid-level cleric. He was a supreme leader at the end of the day because he was a consensus candidate, right? So he doesn't carry the weight of religious legitimacy. And this is something that's dogged him in terms of foreign policy ever since. A great example of this is the fact that the most important Ayatollah in Shiite Islam is an Iranian. He's Iraqi. He's a guy by the name of Ali Sistani. He lives next door in Iraq. He's under house arrest by Iranian forces for precisely the fact that his interpretation of Shiism's role in the world, both role with relation to Sunni Islam and also role with relation to Christianity and sort of the rest of the world, is markedly different. It's quietist, it's more compliant, it's far less radical, and it's one that, frankly, if it was announced, if it was propounded, if it was supported, would be a tremendous detriment to what Iran is trying to build. Iran is trying to co-opt the voice of this minority within the Islamic world. And I think so far they've done so very successfully, but they're not the only voice out there.
Okay, yeah, all the way in the back.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, do you foresee a scenario in Yemen, for example, where the proxy war with Iran backing the Houthis, us backing Saudi Arabia by extension, somehow spirals out of control and we have to get more involved in Yemen, and also perhaps Bahrain with the Iran backing the majority Shia population and us backing the Khalifa family?
Right. Well, Bahrain is, I think, a little bit of a different case. What happened in Bahrain, sort of in the 2011-2012 period, was this grassroots groundswell of discontent, fomented, at least in part, by Iran, on the part of the Shia in that country against the ruling Sunni al-Khalifa family. And the discontent became so great, or at least the neighbors became so nervous, that the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, inserted, 1,100 troops into the kingdom and has pacified, or I don't know if pacify is the right word, but has pacified that problem ever since. And it's clear that those troops who are now no longer there would go back, and would go back soon if that happened. So I think the al-Khalifa family may sleep with one eye open, but they sleep at least somewhat soundly for now. Yemen is a different story, I think. And in Yemen, you're looking at a series of at least 3 really complicated interlocking problems, because you have al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You have Islamists associated also with the Islamic State. You have a separatist movement, which is supported by Iran, which is the potential proxy war with the dominant, or what used to be the dominant Sunni al-Hadi government. And then you have a secessionist movement in which the South is attempting to secede from the entirety of Yemen, pursuant to an agreement that was hammered out about 25 years ago. So putting that Humpty Dumpty back together again is going to, I think, be very difficult. And these security challenges have the potential to amplify one another. The idea that a tactical air campaign waged by the Saudis against the Houthis could become broader if there are signs of Islamist activity that the Saudis are nervous about, could lead to a regional war. So I think Yemen is one of those places where, if you're looking for future hotspots, it's a pretty good bet. So.
Okay, this gentleman, then you, and then you.
As we know, next year there's going to be an election and a change of administrations. If the Democrats retain the White House, what do you foresee happening in public policy? And do you have any information as to the stated ideas of Secretary Clinton, Senator Sanders, and Vice President Biden, and what they would do?
So I think this is a good question. I'm not one to read the tea leaves here. I would point out, though, that you've heard, not on the Democratic side so much, but on the Republican side, you've heard a number of candidates who have said that they're going to throw out the deal on day one. For a whole host of reasons, I think that that's a nice rhetorical flourish, but that's not actually practically applicable, because the deal will be in force for 16 months if and when they take office, meaning that the money will already be dispersed, all the ill effects that we've talked about here will already be put in motion. So it's not enough just to say this deal is null and void. You have to have a broader strategy. And this, I think, really sort of to accentuate the positive, I think we are now entering a zone of opportunity where we can do just that. There hasn't been a lot of work, real sort of serious work on thinking about what Iran is likely to do, right? I started talking about it a little bit, but serious work about what we can expect and whether or not, our constituent agencies and offices, Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the military, the Defense Intelligence Agency, what have you, right? Whatever you're talking about, are positioned properly, are resourced properly to actually take account of all these things that Iran is likely to do in the near term. For those of you that followed sort of Soviet politics sort of back in the day, right? No one's really done a red team of how the Iranians are likely to behave as a result of the nuclear deal. And the reason I say this is an opportunity is because it's an opportunity to do some really good policy work. But it's also an opportunity here on the Hill, because I think we're entering a period where there's going to be a whole host of congressional members, both in the House and in the Senate, who may not have voted the way their constituents would have liked them to vote on the nuclear deal. And they're going to be at pains to prove to their constituents and to the country at large that they are not soft on Iran, that they support the security of Israel, to support the security of our Gulf allies, to support the security of the United States. And so for those of us that can arm ourselves with the right intellectual arguments to tell them, here are the things you need to do. Now that you've voted incorrectly on the deal, now that the deal is a done deal, sorry for the mixed phrase, whatever. Now that the deal is actually in effect, here are the things we can expect, and here's how you need to respond. What's been missing so far in the national debate is precisely that conversation. We focus so much on whipping the vote to make sure the deal doesn't pass that we've sort of missed the forest for the trees. The deal is a done deal. And so now we have to think about what the day after the JCPOA looks like. And frankly, we don't have much by way of a strategy, at least not yet, but we have the opportunity to build one.
Jim Phillips is right. All right, this young lady.
Hi, I have two questions
Sure.
that kind of piggyback off of each other. So you mentioned the IRGC's involvement in Syria, but what you didn't mention was Iran's support of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so my first question is, how much of Iran's intention for involvement in Syria actually has to do with wanting to preserve the regime, and how much of that is, just wanting to keep that pipeline open in Syria between Russia, Iran, and Lebanon? And then the second question is, if Assad falls, and I say if with purpose, not when, because people have been saying that he'll fall for the last 40 years.
Well, at some point they'll be right? I mean, he'll die of old age and,
maybe in another 40 years. So what implication will that have on like regional security, not like broader Middle East, but specifically in the Levant with, the lack of resources coming to Hezbollah? Would Israel perhaps invade and take advantage of that? What do you think would happen?
So the first, that's a lot, but so the first part, no, it's okay. First part first. I think what you see on the part of Hezbollah behavior is a reflection of the fact that it's both. The Iranians certainly want to keep the Assad regime in power, and they also want to keep that foothold that they have in the Levant that Hezbollah provides them in the south of Lebanon. And the reason you can sort of see this is because Hezbollah, which they publicly announced their charter in 1985, actually pledged formal allegiance to the Velayat Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent that is the governing ideology of Iran. Right? This is an Iranian proxy, tried and true, as well as a national Lebanese political party. What's happening and what has happened so far to Hezbollah in Syria has been likened to Hezbollah's Vietnam. Right? There's been an enormously costly campaign. Hezbollah has been attrited in terms of human fighters, in terms of the economic cost that is put upon the organization. And it's because Hezbollah is carrying out the will, in part, of the Iranian regime. Iran cares very deeply about Assad, both because he is a reliable ally, but also because the Iranians understand very well that if Assad falls, that connection, that organic connection that they have with being able to exert power in Lebanon and the Palestinian territories is severed, right? And that leads to your second question, which is, what does Syria look like? If he falls, what does it look like? So I think what you're going to see is, first of all, I agree with you. I don't think it's a done deal that he falls, but I think if you talk to analysts who are looking at Syria, they'll tell you that Whereas before, Assad was fighting from that third that was his stronghold outside into these other quadrants. He's now fighting inside for control of cities like Damascus and Homs. And it suggests that the tide is turning. Whether it turns all the way is a different story, but it's turning. Something's happening. And if it continues to happen, if he continues to lose control, what you're going to get is a country that's very unlikely to be unitary again, at least in the near term. You're likely to have a balkanization of Syria. And that creates enormous problems for Iran in terms of exerting influence in that part of the world and in the Levant. But it also creates enormous security concerns for countries like Israel. Now, I don't think the Israelis are going to invade. I think the Israelis don't have the manpower to do that, nor do they have the interest. But I think they will do exactly what they've done so far, which is when they see the spillover of the fighting begin to head their way towards the north of Israel, they will carry out tactical airstrikes to make sure that it stays on that side of the border. But in the absence of that, I think sober analysts of sober analysts who are looking at what's happening in Syria at least have to countenance the possibility that it may be impossible to put Syria in the near term back together again. If Assad falls, what you're left with is not another country. What you're left with is a whole series of fiefdoms. And some of them may be controlled by people we like, but at least according to the current constellation of forces, a lot of them are going to be controlled by people that we don't. So.
Okay, Hermes, we have time for one short one.
Thank you. My question is short. Is there in Iran any credible opposition, known or unknown?
So I think really that may be one of the most important questions, because you can't fight something with nothing. And if you are with me so far, right, in this hour, and you understand that this is a regime that, frankly, doesn't have the best interests of the United States at heart, and it's expansionist, and it's rapacious, and it's likely to cheat, and it's likely to do more of exactly the things that it's been doing so far with the resources from the deal, what's the alternative? I think there is less optimism that there is a coherent Iranian opposition today than there was a couple of years ago, and less then than there were a couple of years before that. The Iranian regime has been very good at identifying and eliminating the political currents that are coalescing into sizable political movements. By the way, part of that, I would argue, is our fault on a bipartisan level. We talk a lot about Iran's urge for democracy, but we don't do anything to support it. And sometimes we do even worse. So when the Iranians rise up, when they rose up, it was in the summer of 2009, it was a spontaneous act. It didn't require anything from the United States. It wasn't contingent on American aid. It wasn't contingent on sort of American boots on the ground. But what it was contingent on was being able to constrain the Iranian regime from responding in the months and weeks that followed. And we didn't do that. We were in the process of trying to hammer out this outreach policy towards Iran. We studiously avoided getting involved. President Obama talked about this being a domestic matter. And that message resonated not with the people, but with the regime. The regime understood that there would be no adverse consequences for bearing down on their democratic opposition. And so that's exactly what they did. So creating a situation where it's more difficult for Iran to constrain, to disaggregate, to oppress its democratic opponents should be a key goal of American strategy. But it's going to be one that's going to be even harder to achieve now, because we've strengthened the first Iran at the expense of the second. So.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you, guys. Buy the book. There are pictures. No, there are no pictures, but you should buy.